Hello everyone, and welcome back for the next installment in my video series about vampires. If you're new to this and you want to see who I am, why I'm doing this, you want to check out part 1 of my video series. This is the second video that I'm making. This is going to talk about the pre-cinema vampire. The question I want to ask in this is, what made vampires a viable form of movies? Because when you think about it, you look at movies, right? You look at genres of movies. And you've got, romantic movies, you've got comedy movies, you've got murder mystery movies, detective crime drama movies. And that makes sense. They fall into everyday human life. There are a few fantastic type of genres, fantasy, science fiction, but even that, we can kind of, science fiction in particular makes sense just because we're a technological species. Obviously, this camera that I'm talking to you in is the product of science, and a long time ago would have been considered science fiction. Science fiction makes sense because of all our technological stuff, and people will always speculate on what's going to come next. So that makes sense. But then you come to vampire movies. Yeah, I went there. So vampires are just this strange thing. We just sort of accept it at this point because there's been such a long history of vampires in cinema. We don't question it anymore. It's just something that's always been. But when you think about it, it's just one of the strangest things to make movies about. So where did it come from? Why is there even such a thing as vampires? So that's what I want to explore in this video today. So, I will be reading from a script because I've got a lot of information here that I want to get through. And I don't want to miss anything. There's a lot of important points. I'll try to get through this as quickly and painlessly as I can. So, let me start by saying, creatures of darkness have always existed in human storytelling for as long as there has been humans to tell stories. And the thing is, we don't really know when storytelling began. It goes back so far before there was anything, before we had the ability to write stories down. People were telling them orally, passing it on, traveling, giving it to other cultures. Those cultures would take the stories, the motifs, the ideas in them, and make them their own and change them around. And just through the years, a lot of ideas have just transformed to where you can see similarities when you compare them together, but just surface level, you wouldn't even think a lot of these things even have anything to do with each other. And that's what I found pretty interesting looking into this. And within the storytelling, there's always been traditions of, supernatural beings in some form or another, whether good or evil, and here's the interesting thing, when you stop and think about it, is that they live in places that human beings ordinarily don't exist in. They live in conditions that ordinary people may deal with a little bit, but the idea of a whole place being like that, being so radically different and alien, it's just, how did that come about? Because you would think that people would write about and speak about what they knew, what experiences they were most familiar with. So when you're talking about, a heaven or a hell or a Valhalla or, a land of darkness, a place in fire, a hell, a Tartarus, an underworld, that these are just places that it'd be hard to imagine, but they're so familiar to us that we don't really have any trouble imagining them. We think of these places in in a way that they're almost as if they are real places, that someone's visited them and taken pictures, and we're just talking like, oh, did you hear that place that so and so went to? And here's everything about it: pearly gates, big fire, frozen lands, and halls with warriors with drinking beer till the end of time. It's just something that people just accept at this point. But where these stories came from, how these ideas came about, your guess is as good as mine. But in these stories, probably there are themes that come about that are very important. That, again, at surface level, you just see them in one way, but when you look deeper, you can see more there. For example, we have I want to compare two examples. The story of Lucifer, the devil, first off, a being who was originally an angel, and he was changed into, he changed and then he became the devil, and he was cast into a land of darkness where he couldn't go back to the light ever again. Then you have the example of, in the Greeks, or even in the Norse tradition too, come to think of it, but in the Greeks you've got the Titans, who are the original beings, if you will, and then the gods came along and dethroned them and sent the Titans into Tartarus. In the Norse tradition, as I just thought of, you had the frost giants, and then the gods came and got rid of them. And what do these stories all have in common is that people change and times change. And that is really one of the important themes in storytelling since the beginning of it, is that people and how they deal with change. Do they accept it? Do they not accept it? Is it hard for them? Is it easy for them? Do they try to bargain for more time? Do they just say, hey, I've lived in my time and I'm good to go? These variations on, very simple things, but the amount of stories that explore that idea, that they're ongoing even to this day. And ancient times were no different. And one of the earliest examples of this is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, those of you unfamiliar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was this Herculean type figure. Or if you don't even know who that is, think like Superman. Just this half man, half god figure. Super strong. He got whatever he wanted. He was the king of his land. This was a person who the word no was not in his vocabulary. And then one day, something happens that's beyond his power. And it's the first time in his life that something happens that is outside of his control. That all his strength, all his power, it's meaningless. And that is, his best friend dies. And this sends him on a quest through his own, hero's journey, where he eventually encounters a man, and I'm probably going to butcher this name here, but his name is Utnapishtim. Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. Which, translated, so I understand, means the far away. And Utnapishtim, is a immortal being. He was human originally, and he was transformed by the gods to be an immortal being, along with his wife. And they live on an island away from the rest of humanity, which is why he's the far away. It's a long trip to get to see him and his wife. And Gilgamesh visits him, thinking that because he's immortal, he'll know the secrets of life and death, and that he'll be able to restore his friend. Turns out that's not the case. They try to help him. They're good immortals. They've been through their own fair share of tragedy, and they've been around for a long time to come to terms with that stuff and to give Gilgamesh advice on how to live the rest of his life and accept things for the way they are. But you've got this archetype, this motif of a mortal being visiting an immortal being in a faraway place where there aren't any other humans around, with his wife. This was, 2000 BC, or further back than that, I think even. But you travel in time 4,000 years later, and the theme of a mortal being visiting an immortal in his home far away from the rest of humanity where his wife or wives live takes on a whole new meaning. It becomes something horrifying that's, what we're familiar with today. So, what I wanted to know is, how do we go from one to the other? And that's the journey that I want to go about discovering and sharing with you all today. Now, the first thing to keep in mind when talking about vampires is that the term vampire, and even the fully formed idea of what a vampire is only about maybe 200 or 300 years old, which it seems like a long time, but it's short relative to the history of storytelling as a whole, and even written storytelling. So, we've got some proto-vampires that I want to talk about here. Just checking my time real quick here. I've got about a few minutes before I gotta dump this and then try add more time to this, but so I'll try to go quickly with this. With the pre, I'll probably just have to get through the pre stuff here and then come back, talk about the rest. But the first pre-vampire that we recognize elements of modern day vampire in comes from India. And this is another word that I'm probably going to butcher. The Batial, or Batial, but I'm going to go with Batial. And the Batial is a spirit that inhabits a corpse and reanimates it. So this could be the same person re-inhabiting their body. It could be a different spirit inhabiting a body. So this is sort of the origin of, you see in a lot of vampire movies where someone will say, the person's changed to a vampire, they come back to their loved one, and there's somebody else there who's like, that person, that's not who you think they are. They're not so and so anymore. There's someone else, in their body doing stuff with it. That's not the person that you knew. And that concept kind of comes from the Batial. And the most famous Batial story is what we call today now, because I cannot pronounce the Indian Sanskrit version of this, so I'm just going to go with the English translation, Vikram and the Vampire. Now, Vikram and the Vampire is a story from India, about 700 BC, where there's this guy, King Vikram, and he's walking through a forest one night, and he comes across the Batial. The Batial is hanging upside down from a tree, like a bat. And Vikram tries to capture the Batial, but the Batial is superhuman and beyond the king's power, so he can do whatever he wants. The king is just basically like a child compared to the Batial. So the Batial, wanting things to be interesting, issues a challenge to King Vikram. And the challenge is that he's going to tell King Vikram a story. At the end of the story, he's going to either ask him a question or a riddle. And if the king gets it right, he'll go with the king. And, be his prisoner or whatever the king has in mind for him. If the king gets the question wrong, or the riddle wrong, he just goes back to his tree, the king leaves him alone. But the interesting thing is, it's the storytelling, the narrative in this, is that one story leads into another, leads into another, leads into another, even after the king answers the questions. It's very similar to a much more famous story, the 1001 Arabian Nights. Only, I think this one's a little more interesting, personally. A little biased, I admit, because in Arabian Nights, it's a newly married woman to a king who's telling all these stories to the king. But, you either have a newly married woman or a vampire, So I'll take the vampire. Much more interesting to me. So I might have to stop right here for a minute, and I'll come back and talk about the rest and try to get into the literary tradition in this video as well. So I'll be right back.